We're on step 4 on obedience. Chapter 41. There are two segments in the letter in which they talk rather extensively about the prison, which is, if you've all been looking at, that's what we're dealing with. When I first encountered the parts about the prison, I basically, when I was reading this for the first time when I was about 19 or 20, I closed the book and put it back on the shelf. I figured, I'm not ready for this. And there's an aspect still of this in which I'm not ready for this. So can kind of take it academically, and it's it's interesting, but I don't understand it at all. And it's the same thing also with Father Sophronius in St. Silouan. St. Silouan received the saying from Christ, keep your mind in hell and despair not. That works for some people. Then some people understand it and identify with it and can embrace it, and others, it makes no sense. So, but that's how things are in reading some of this literature. Some of it is very universally applicable, and some of it is not. So, who would like to read chapter starting with 41?
I can read from off.
Okay. And do you want to?
Well, if I just stand, pick up the audio.
Okay.
At a distance of a mile from the great monastery was a place called the prison, deprived of every comfort. There neither smoke nor wine nor oil in the food, nor anything else could ever be seen, but only bread and light vegetables. Here the pastor shut up without permission to go out those who fell into sin after entering the brotherhood, and not all together, but each in a separate and special cell, or at most in pairs. And he kept them there until the Lord gave him assurance of the amendment of each one. Over them he placed the sub-prior, a great man called Isaac, who required of those entrusted to him almost unceasing prayer. And to prevent despondency, they had a large quantity of palm leaves. Such is the life, such is the rule, such is the conduct of those who truly seek the face of the God of Jacob. To admire the labors of the saints is good, to emulate them wins salvation, but to wish suddenly to imitate their life in every point is unreasonable and impossible. When we are stung by rebukes, let us remember our sins unto the Lord, seeing the force of our efforts, those efforts of those who do violence to themselves for his sake, wipes out our sins and transforms the sorrow that is gnawing at our heart into joy. For it is said, according to the multitude of the sorrows in my heart, thy consolations brought gladness into my soul. At the right time let us not forget him who said to the Lord, how great are the many and evil afflictions which thou hast showed unto me. Yet, having returned, thou madest me to live, and out of the depths of the earth, after I had fallen, thou broughtest me up. Blessed is he, though maligned and disparaged every day, for the Lord's sake, constrains himself to be patient. He will join in the chorus of the martyrs, and boldly converse with the angels. Blessed is the monk who regards himself as hourly deserving every dishonor and disparagement. Blessed is he who mortifies his will to the end, and leaves the care of himself to his director in the Lord, for he will be placed at the right hand of the crucified. He who will not accept a reproof, just or unjust, renounces his own salvation, but he who accepts it with an effort, or even without an effort, will soon receive the remission of his sins.
Okay, this is really important. Um, one of the things that is, and especially in the first chapters of this step, talks about how the superior will reprove, insult, berate, degrade, and just be very, well, we would probably say abusive to his monks, and this is seen as a great virtue. Now, part of it is it's the nature of the spiritual trauma that was part of their culture, which is alien to our culture as Americans. But it's also something that we don't know how to handle. Because if somebody reproaches us, rebukes us, slanders us, makes us do something strange, like calling us from the table at dinner, gives us a blessing and makes us stand there for the next hour, like in the stories behind or before, or much less to stay in a prostration for several hours, and then tell us, okay, you can get up now. Don't be so patient and obstinate. Go away. And we react. Well, we've lost the whole point. Is we have failed in the task of learning, of gaining the spiritual knowledge about ourselves, if we allow ourselves to react. If we try and defend ourselves, if we try and justify ourselves, if we try and contradict what was said, if we try and question it, if we start slandering and judging the superior who did this to us, and think ourselves wronged and victims and all of that, we've totally lost the point. And the point is, A, it's to not react, and B, that these are exercises that are given to us to teach us that patience, that non-reaction, that peace, so that we don't allow ourselves to fall into some other sin. Okay, keep going.
45. Spiritually show God your faith in your Father and your sincere love for him, and God in unknown ways will suggest to him that he become attached to you and kindly disposed towards you, just as you are well disposed towards him. He who exposes every snake shows that he has real faith, but he who hides them still wanders in trackless wastes. A man will know his brotherly love and genuine charity when he sees that he mourns for his brother's sins and rejoices at his progress and gifts. He whose will and desire in conversation is to establish his own opinion, even though what he says is true, should recognize that he is sick with the devil's disease. And if he behaves like this only in conversation with his equals, then perhaps the rebuke of his superiors may heal him. But if he acts in this way even with those who are greater and wiser than he, then his malady is humanly incurable.
Okay. So this is a really important point. Is that especially it's one thing to have some kind of good-natured banter with your equals, but when you're dealing with the superior, it's always a situation of subordinating yourself and of accepting whatever is said, period, without justifying yourself, and without 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 trying to correct or trying to establish your own opinion or actually even saying anything. In the monastic world, the equivalent to "yes, sir" is "may it be blessed." And there's a saying in monastic life that the only words, there's only two phrases that you need to know. One is "may it be blessed," and the second one is "forgive me." And that's it. Otherwise, it's, the ideal is silence. No chattering, no talking, and especially no self-justification, no opinions, no nothing. Just silence and watch and learn. And when you're tested, especially be silent, and may it be blessed. Forgive me. That's it. Otherwise, it's all pride and vainglory, all that chatter, and especially if it's about self-opinion or trying to justify oneself, it's truly just pride and vainglory. Okay.
He who is not submissive in speech clearly will not be so in act either. For he who is unfaithful in little is also unfaithful in much, and is intractable. He labors in vain, and he will get nothing from holy obedience but his own doom. If anyone has conscience and the utmost purity in the matter of obedience to his spiritual father, then he daily awaits death as if it were sleep, or rather life, and is not dismayed, knowing for certain that at the time of his departure, not he but his director will be called to account. If without constraint,
if I can say, this is the mystery of spiritual fatherhood, and even if it's not a situation of absolute obedience, if you're a spiritual father, you have to give account for those under your spiritual direction, and the Book of Hebrews reinforces that. It says as much. So it's a scriptural principle, and I can tell you that when we had this this one novice at the monastery who accidentally drowned, I knew there were times that I was standing with him before the throne of God, answering for him. It's a profound mystery. So,
if without constraint anyone receives some task from his father, and in doing it suffers a stumble, he should not ascribe the blame to the giver, but to the receiver of the weapon. For he took the weapon for battle against the enemy, but has turned it against his own heart. But if he forced himself for the Lord's sake to accept the task, though he previously explained his weaknesses to him who gave it, let him take courage, for though he has fallen, he is not dead. I have forgotten to set before you, my friends, this sweet bread of virtue. I saw there men of obedience to the Lord, who insulted and dishonored themselves for God's sake, so that, having prepared themselves in this way, they may get used to not quailing before insults coming from others. By resolving to make one's confession, the soul is thereby held from sinning as by a bridle. For what we do not confess, that we do fearlessly, as though in the dark. When in the absence of the superior, we imagine his face and think that he is always standing by us, and avoid every meeting or word or food or sleep or anything else that we think he would not like. Then we have really learnt true obedience. Base-born children regard the absence of their teacher as a joy, but legitimate ones think it a loss.
and this is also a very important principle in monastic life. If you've got a situation that when the cat's away, the mice will play, it's not a healthy community. and you know that people are really obedient, not simply when they do what they're told, specifically, but when they anticipate what the superior would want them to do.
So basically what you're saying is like a dog anticipates what the master's command.
A dog anticipates.
Like dogs will anticipate the master's command, like be eager to do it and try to figure out what you're going to say before you say it. And we'll start, like if, for example, if they think you're going to ask them to sit, they'll start sitting immediately. Like that type of thing. But
Yeah.
a similar behavior.
Right. Well, in this case, it would be, well, I don't know, set the table, who knows,
Right.
weed the garden.
I once asked one of the most experienced fathers and pressed him to tell me how humility is obtained by obedience. He said the obedient man who has discernment, even if he raises the dead and receives the gift of tears and freedom from the conflict, will still think that it is the prayer of his spiritual father that has done it, and he remains foreign and alien to vain presumption. For how could he possibly pride himself on what he has done, as he himself admits, by the help of his father, not by his own effort? But the practice of the above virtues is unknown to the solitary, for his rigors have brought him conceit and suggest to him that his achievements are due in his own effort. He who lives in obedience has eluded two snares, and remains eternally an obedient servant of Christ.
One of the things that you find in the monastic literature is that there's this tension between those who live in obedience in communities and solitaries. So, St. Basil the Great talks extensively about solitaries and what a waste of time it is, and how they're just doing their own will, and how easily they just fall into, into despondency and the noonday demon, and there's nobody there to pick them up, and that it's not an appropriate lifestyle. Which is pretty radical, St. Basil was one of the most important factors in establishing the monastic life. So, even here. And St. John lived as a solitary. So, yeah.
The devil battles with those in obedience, sometimes to defile them with bodily pollutions and make them hard-hearted, and sometimes to make them more agitated than usual. At other times he makes them dry and barren, sluggish in prayer, drowsy and benighted, in order to tear them away from their struggle by making them think that they have gained nothing by their obedience, but are only backsliding. For he does not allow them time to reflect that often the providential withdrawal of our imagined goods or blessings leads us to the deepest humility. Some have often repelled the deceiver by patience, but while he is still speaking, another angel stands by us and after a little while tries to hoodwink us in another way. I have seen some living in obedience who, through their father's direction, became filled with compunction, meek, temperate, zealous, free from inner conflicts and fervent. But demons came to them and sowed in them the thought that they now had the qualifications for the solitary life, and that in stillness they would attain the freedom from passion as the final prize. Thus deceived, they left their harbor and put out to sea, but when the storm came down upon them, they were pitifully exposed to danger from this foul and briny ocean, through being unprovided with pilots. This sea is bound to be stirred up and roused and enraged, so as to cast out of it again onto the dry land of the wood and hay and all the corruption that was brought down onto it by the rivers of the passions. Let us watch nature, and we shall find that after a storm at sea there comes a deep calm. He who is sometimes obedient to his father and sometimes disobedient is like a person who sometimes puts lotion in his eyes and sometimes quicklime. For it is said, when one builds and another pulls down, what profit have they but the labor? Do not be deceived, son, an obedient servant of the Lord, by the spirit of conceit, so that you confess your own sins to your master as if they were another person's. You cannot escape shame except by shame. It is often the habit of demons to persuade us either not to confess, or to do so as if we were confessing another person's sins, or to lay the blame of our sin on others. Lay bare your wound to the physician, and, without being ashamed, say, "It is my wound, Father, it is my plague, caused by my own negligence, and not by anything else. No one is to blame for this, no man, no spirit, no body, nothing but my own carelessness."
It's really important to take responsibility for one's sins and to confess them honestly, forthrightly, and plainly. And all these last few paragraphs are essentially dealing with the kinds of demonic temptations that afflict novices.
At confession, be like a condemned criminal in disposition and in outward appearance and in thought. Cast your eyes to the earth, and if possible, sprinkle the feet of your judge and physician as the feet of Christ with your tears. If everything depends on habit and follows upon it, then still more do the virtues depend on habit, for they have God as their great fellow laborer. You will not labor many years, son, in search of the blessed inner peace, if in the beginning you surrender yourself with your whole soul to indignities. Do not think that it is improper to make your confession to your helper as to God in a prostrate position. I have seen condemned criminals, by their sorry appearance and violent confession and entreaty, soften the severity of the judge and change his anger into mercy. That is why even John the Baptist required confession before baptism of those who came to him, not because he himself needed to know their sins, but so as to effect their salvation. Let us not be surprised if, even after confession, we are still attacked, for it is better to war with pollutions than with conceit. Do not be overeager, and do not be carried away when you hear tales of the Hezekiahs and the Anchorites, for you are marching in the army of the first martyr. And if you fall, do not leave the practice ground, for then especially, more than ever, we need a physician. He who strikes his foot against a stone when he has help would certainly not only stumble unaided, but would have died.
So, one of the key things in pursuing this life is perseverance, no matter what. Just hang in there, no matter what, no matter how much you fall, no matter how completely you fall, no matter, if you've done a face plant in the mud, you get up, dust yourself off, and keep going the way you were going, and just push ahead, no matter what the obstacles.
That's just
So there's a story of a young guy who I knew in San Francisco, and he was out in the middle of the big church in the old Joy of All Who Sorrow Cathedral in San Francisco, which is this huge old Anglican cathedral from the 1870s, which has a vast expanse of hardwood floor. And he was trying to get the wax up after Pascha, when everybody was standing there with candles. It's about 6 times the size of St. Herman's. And it's a pretty daunting task when you're on your hands and knees with a razor blade. And so the priest saw that he was flagging a little bit, and he said to him, "Luke, whatever you do, simply persevere. Don't let anything pull you away from the path that you're going. Just persevere." That young man ended up joining St. Sabas Monastery in Jerusalem. He's the only American and convert who's ever survived there, and is a monk there or in one of the monasteries that's subordinate to it. So he did survive, and he did persevere.
It's not that unusual.
What's that?
It's not that unusual. In 1967, my first night at boot camp, we got in, we had to wait till morning to get our uniforms issued. They gave us each a razor blade and told us to strip the wax off the floor in the squad bay. Spent all night.
That's good.
Yeah.
And if you'd been Russian Orthodox, you would have known exactly what to do.
We did it.
Yeah.
But he was St. Thomas, was the monastery particularly tough, is that why you say?
St. Sabas? St. Sabas,
St.
yeah.
Sabas,
Yeah, it's the one in the canyon on the way to Jericho from Jerusalem. And yes, it's extremely tough, extremely ascetic, and very, very strict, very serious. So, and they don't get many novices in the first place, and very seldom do Westerners survive there. So, when you start again, say the number of the paragraph.
I believe it's 69.
Mm-hmm.
When we are brought down, then the demons quickly attack us, and seizing on a reasonable or rather unreasonable pretext, they suggest stillness to us. The aim of our enemies is to add wounds to our fall. When a physician protests his incompetence, then you have to go to another, because few are healed without a physician. And who would think of contradicting us when we would say that every ship that encounters shipwreck with a skilled pilot would be utterly lost without a pilot? From obedience comes humility, and from humility comes dispassion. For in our humility the Lord remembered and redeemed us from our enemies. Therefore nothing prevents us from saying that from obedience comes dispassion, through which the goal of humility is attained. For humility is the beginning of dispassion, as Moses is the beginning of the law, and the daughter perfects the mother, as Mary perfects the synagogue. Those sick souls who try out a physician and receive help from him, and then abandon him out of preference for another before they are completely healed, deserve every punishment from God. Do not run from the hands of him who has brought you to the Lord, for you will never in your life esteem anyone like him.
That's an important principle.
73. It is dangerous for an inexperienced soldier to leave his regiment and engage in single combat, and it is not without peril for a monk to attempt stillness before he has had much experience and practice in the struggle with the passions of the soul. The one subjects his body to danger, and the other risks his soul. Two are better than one, says Scripture. That is to say, it is better for a son to be with his father, and to struggle with his proclivities, with the help of the divine power of the Holy Spirit. He who deprives a blind man of his leader, a flock of its shepherd, a lost man of his guide, a child of its father, a patient of his doctor, a ship of its pilot, imperils all. And he who attempts unaided to struggle with the spirits is slain by them. Let us entering a hospital for the first time indicate their pains. Let those entering a hospital for the first time indicate their pains, and let those entering upon obedience show their humility. For the former, the first sign of their health is the relief of their pains, and for the latter, a growing self-condemnation, and there is no other sign so unerring. Let your conscience be the mirror of your obedience, and it is enough.
Okay. These couple paragraphs. One of the biggest temptations for novices entering into a life of obedience is to go off and to live as a hermit in stillness. And it's really, and you know, these temptations, they just come on almost automatically. It's really amazing, you know. In fact, you can kind of tell where somebody is along the path by the kind of passion, kind of temptations that they're having, because there's this whole series of temptations that they have to go through. And one of the earlier ones is that they want to go off and live as hesychasts, which means not in obedience, but as solitaries. Well, They're about as ready for being a solitary as they are to be tonsured or ordained. But so it's just it really is just a temptation of the demons. So it's very important. This whole relationship of discipleship to an elder monk, to an elder is the real key in spiritual life, and that really needs to be the first thing that you look for when you look towards monastic life, as it's here. Okay.
76. Those living in stillness, subject to a father, have only demons working against them. But those living in a community struggle with demons and human beings. The former, being always under the eyes of the master, keep his commands more strictly, but the latter, on account of his absence, break them to some extent. However, those who are zealous and industrious more than make up for this failing by enduring collisions and knocks, and win double crowns. Let us keep guard over ourselves with all care. For when a harbor is full of ships, it is easy for them to get crushed by each other, especially if they are secretly riddled with bad temper as by some worm. Let us practice extreme silence and ignorance in the presence of the superior. For a silent man is a son of philosophy, always acquiring much knowledge. I have seen a monastic who used to snatch the words from his superior's lips, but I despaired of his obedience when I saw it led to pride and not to humility. Let us keep wide awake with all vigilance, take care with all carefulness, watch with all watchfulness as to when and how service should be preferred to prayer, for this is certainly not always the case. Attend to yourself in the presence of your brethren, and never try to appear more righteous than they are in any circumstance whatsoever. For if you do, you will have wrought a double ill. You will sting them by your false and hypocritical zeal, and you will assuredly gain presumption for yourself. Be zealous within your soul, without showing it in the least outwardly, either by visible sign, or by word, or by a hint. And you will only do this when you stop looking down on your neighbor. But if you are still inclined to do this, become like your brethren, so that you do not differ from them in simply in being conceited.
This is slightly burning, you know. If you're still inclined to do this, become like your brethren, so that you do not differ from them simply in being conceited. That's really. One of the biggest temptations is comparison, with comparing oneself with everybody else, and of course it's always wrong, and it's always tempered by our passions, and almost always gets us deeper digs the hole deeper than it was before. So, okay.
83. I saw an inexperienced disciple who, in the presence of certain people, boasted of the achievements of his teacher, thinking to win glory for himself from another's harvest. But he only earned for himself dishonor, for everyone asked him, "But how could a good tree grow such a barren branch?" It is not when we courageously endure the derision of our Father that we are judged patient, but when we endure it from all manner of men. For we bear with our Father both out of respect and as of duty to him. Eagerly drink scorn and insult as the water of life from everyone who wants to give you this drink that cleanses from lust. Then a deep purity will dawn in your soul, and the light of God will not grow dim in your heart. If anyone sees that the brotherhood is comforted by his efforts, he should not boast of it in his heart, because thieves are around. Always remember him who said, when you have done all that is commanded of you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. The judgment on our labors we shall know at the time of our death. A monastery is an earthly heaven. Therefore, let us dispose our heart to be like the angels serving the Lord. Sometimes those who live in this heaven have hearts of stone. Sometimes again, through compunction, they attain the consolation in such a way as to avoid conceit or presumption, and they lighten their labors with tears. A little fire softens a large piece of wax. So too a small indignity often softens, sweetens, and wipes away suddenly all the fierceness, insensibility, and hardness of our heart. I once saw two sitting and hiding and watching the labors and listening to the groans of the ascetics. But one was doing this in order to emulate them, the other in order, when the chance came, openly to mock and to impede God's laborer in his good work. Do not be so unreasonably silent as to annoy and embitter others, and do not be slow in your gait and actions when ordered to hasten. Otherwise you will be worse than the possessed and the rebellious. Often I have seen, as Job says, souls suffering from sluggishness of manner, but sometimes from dexterity. And I was amazed at the diversity of evil.
In other words, no passive-aggressive behavior.
"91. He who is not alone, but is with others, cannot derive so much profit from psalmody as from prayer, for the confusion of voices renders the psalmist indistinct. Constantly wrestle with your thought, and whenever it wanders, call it back to you. God does not require from those still under obedience prayer completely free of distractions. Do not despond when your thoughts are plundered, but take courage, and unceasingly recall your mind. Inviolability is proper only to an angel. He who has secretly vowed not to retire from the struggle till his last breath, and to endure 1,000 deaths of body and soul, will not easily fall into any of these defects. For inconsistency of heart and infidelity to one's place cause stumblings and disasters. Those who easily go from place to place are complete failures, for nothing causes fruitlessness as so much as impatience. If you come to an unknown physician in hospital, behave as though you were passing by, and secretly test the life and spiritual experience of all of those living there. And when you begin to feel benefit from the doctors and nurses and get relief from your sickness, and especially with regard to your special disease, namely spiritual pride, then go to them and buy it with gold of humility, and write the contract of parchment and obedience and letters of service, and with the angels as witnesses. And tear up and destroy in the presence of the parchment of your own will. By going from place to place, you squander the price for which Christ bought you. Let the monastery be your tomb before the tomb, for no one will come out of the grave until the general resurrection. And if some have left their tomb, see, they are dead. Let us implore the Lord that this may not happen to us."
This is the zombie chapter.
95. When the senses find the orders heavy, the more lazy decide that they would prefer to devote themselves to prayer. For when they find that they are ordered to do something easy, they run from prayer as from fire. Some undertake a particular duty, but for a brother's peace of mind, at his request they leave it. And some leave their work through laziness, and some do not leave it out of vainglory, and some do not leave it out of zeal. If you have bound yourself by obligations, and perceive that the eye of your soul is not becoming lucid, do not request leave to quit. The proven are proven everywhere. Excuse me. And the reverse is equally true. In the world, slander has caused many separations, but in communities, gluttony produces every fall and disobedience. If you rule over your mistress, i.e. your stomach, every place of residence will give you dispassion. But if she rules over you, then outside the tomb, you will be in danger everywhere. The Lord who makes the blind opens the eyes of the obedient to the virtues in their guide, and he blinds them to his defects. But the hater of good does the opposite. Let us find what is called quicksilver an image of perfect obedience. For though we roll it under any material, it will mix with no defilement. I'm having a horse throat. Can someone else figure it out? We're at 100.
Okay. 100. Let the zealous be particularly attentive to themselves, lest by condemning the careless, they themselves incur worse condemnation. And I think the reason why Lot was justified was because, though living among such people, he never seems to have condemned them. At all times, but most of all during hymnody, let us be still and undistracted, for by distractions the demons aim to bring our prayer to nothing. A servant of the Lord is he who in body stands before men, but in mind knocks at heaven with prayer. Insults, humiliations, and similar things are like the bitterness of wormwood to the soul of a novice, while praises, honors, and approbation are like honey and give birth to all manner of sweetness and pleasure lovers. But let us look at the nature of each. Wormwood purifies all interior filth, while honey increases gall. Let us trust with firm confidence those who have taken upon themselves the care of us in the Lord, even though they order something apparently contrary and opposed to our salvation. For it is then that our faith in them is tested as in a furnace of humiliation. For it is a sign of the truest faith if we obey our superiors without any hesitation, even when we see the opposite of what we had hoped for happening. From obedience comes humility, as we have said earlier. From humility comes discernment, as the great Cassian has said with beautiful and sublime philosophy in his chapter on discernment. From discernment comes clairvoyance, and from clairvoyance comes foreknowledge. And who would not run this fair course of obedience, seeing such blessings in store for him? It was of this great virtue of obedience that the good psalmist said, "Thou hast in thy goodness prepared for the poor, obedient soul, O God, thy presence in his heart." Throughout your life, remember that great athlete who for 18 whole years never heard with his outward ears his superior say the words, "May you be saved," but inwardly heard daily from the Lord not merely, "May you be saved," which is an uncertain wish, but "You are saved," which is definite and sure. Some living in obedience, on noticing the condescension and indulgence of the superior, ask his permission to follow their own desires. But let them know that when they obtain this, they completely deprive themselves of the confessor's crown. For obedience is entirely foreign to hypocrisy and one's own will. There was the man who received an order, but on seeing the intention of the person who gave it, namely that the fulfillment of the order would not give him pleasure, asked to be excused. And another saw this, but unhesitatingly obeyed. The question is, which of them acted more piously? It is impossible that the devil should act contrary to his own will. Let those living a heedless life, whether persevering in one solitary place or in a community, convince you of this. Let the temptation to retire from our place be a proof for us that our life there is pleasing to God. For being warred against is a sign that we are making war.
Okay. I think we should. You want to stop there or go to the end of the chapter?
Go to the end.
There's another 16 verses. There's 16 chapters. Okay. So some of this stuff I'm not commenting on. If you want me to comment on something, raise your hand. But a lot of it seems kind of self-explanatory.
It's very good.
Okay. Just a note before we go into the next section. Of course, in English we pronounce it acacious. In Greek, it's akakios. And there are some of these names that sound very odd in English. For example, who would think of having a man's name be Hyacinth? It's just not very well. But If you go, if you go to the Greek or the Russian, it's Yakinthos, which is it's a strong name, it's a strong name. So, and St. Acacius.
About Senecatios, 110. I will not be silent about something which it is not right to leave in silence, lest I should inhumanly keep to myself what ought to be made known. The famous John the Sabbaite told me things worth hearing, and that he was detached and above all falsehood, and free from words and deeds of evil. You know from your own experience, Holy Father. This man told me, in my monastery in Asia, for that is where the good man came from, there was a certain elder who was extremely careless and dissolute. I say this without passing judgment on him, but simply to state the truth. He obtained, I do not know how, a disciple, a youth called Acacius, simple-hearted but prudent in thought. And he endured so much from this elder that to many people it will perhaps seem incredible. For the elder tormented him daily, not only with insults and indignities, but even with blows. But his patience was not mere senseless endurance. And so, seeing him daily in wretched plight, like the lowest slave, I would ask him when I met him, "What is the matter, Brother Acacius? How are you today?" And he would at once show me a black eye, or a scarred neck or head. But knowing that he was a worker, I would say to him, well done, endure, and it will be for your good." Having spent 9 years with this pitiless elder, he departed to the Lord. 5 days after his burial in the cemetery of the fathers, Acacius's master went to a certain great elder living there and said to him, "Father, Brother Acacius is dead." As soon as the elder heard this, he said, "Believe me, elder, I do not believe it." The other replied, "Come and see." The elder at once rose and went to the cemetery with the master of the blessed athlete. And he called as to a living person to him who was truly alive and is falling asleep, and said, "Are you dead, Brother Acacius?" And the good doer of obedience, showing his obedience even after his death, replied to the great elder, "How is it possible, Father, for a man who is a doer of obedience to die?" Then the elder who had been Acacius's master became terrified and fell on his face in tears. Afterwards he asked the abbot of the Lavra for a cell near the tomb, and lived in it devoutly, always saying to the fathers, "I have committed murder." And it seemed to me, Father John, that the one who spoke to the dead man was the great John himself. For that blessed soul told me another story as if it were about someone else, when it was really about himself, as I was afterwards able to learn for certain. About John the Sabbaite, or Antiochus. There was another said John in the same monastery in Asia, who became a disciple of a certain meek, gentle, and quiet monk. And seeing that the elder honored and cared for him, he rightly judged that this would be fatal for many, and he begged the elder to send him away. As the elder had another disciple, this would not cause him much inconvenience. And so he went away, and with a letter from his master, he settled in a Cenobitic monastery in Pontus. On the first night that he entered this monastery, he saw in a dream his account being made out by someone, and after settling that awful account, he was left a debtor to the sum of 100 pounds of gold. When he woke up, he began to reflect on what he had seen in his dream and said, "Poor Antiochus," for this was his name, "you certainly fall far short of your debt." And when he continued, "I had lived in this monastery for 3 years in unquestioning obedience, and was regarded by all with contempt, and was insulted as the foreigner, for there was no other foreign monk there. Then again I saw in a dream someone giving me a credit note for the payment of 10 pounds of my debt. And so when I woke up and had thought about my dream, I said, 'Still only 10? But when shall I pay the rest?' After that I said to myself, 'Poor Antiochus, still more toil and dishonor for you.' From that time forward I began to pretend to be a blockhead, yet without in any way neglecting the service of all. But when the merciless fathers saw that I willingly served in that same condition, they gave me all the heavy work of the monastery. In such a way of life I spent 13 years, when in a dream I saw those who had appeared to me before, and they gave me a receipt and complete settlement of my debt. So when the members of the monastery imposed upon me in any way, I remembered my debt and endured it courageously. So you see, Father John, that wise John told me that as if it were about another person, and that was why he changed his name to Antiochus. But in actual fact, it was he himself who so courageously blotted out the handwriting by his patience and obedience. Let us hear what a gift of discernment this holy man obtained by his utter obedience. When he was residing in the monastery of St. Sabas, 3 young monks came to him, wanting to become his disciples. He gladly received them and at once gave them kindly hospitality, wanting to refresh them after the labor of their journey. When 3 days had passed, the elder said to them, "By nature, brothers, I am prone to fornication, and I cannot accept any of you." But they were not scandalized, for they knew the good work of the elder. Yet however much they asked him, they were quite unable to persuade him. Then they threw themselves at his feet and implored him at least to give them a rule, how and where they ought to live. So he yielded to their entreaties, and knowing that they would receive it with humility and obedience, the elder said to one, "The Lord wants you, child, to live in a place of solitude, in subjection to a father." And to the second he said, "Go and sell your will and give it to God, and take up your cross, and persevere in a community and monastery of brethren, and you will certainly have treasure in heaven." Then to the third he said, "Take in with your very breath the word of him who said, 'He that endureth to the end shall be saved.' Go, and if possible, choose for your trainer in the Lord the most strict and exacting person, and with daily perseverance drink abuse and scorn as milk and honey." Then the brother said to the great John, "But Father, what if the trainer lives a lax life?" The elder replied, "Even if you see him committing fornication, do not leave him, but say to yourself, 'Friend, wherefore art thou come?' Then you will see all pride vanish from you, and lust wither." Let all of us who wish to fear the Lord struggle with our whole might, so that in the school of virtue we do not acquire for ourselves malice and vice, cunning and craftiness, curiosity and anger. For it does happen, and no wonder. As long as a man is a private individual, or a seaman, or a tiller of the soil, the king's enemies do not war so much against him. But when they see him taking the king's colors, and the shield, and the dagger, and the sword, and the bow, and clad in soldier's garb, then they gnash at him with their teeth, and do all in their power to destroy him. And so let us not slumber. I have seen innocent and most beautiful children come to school for the sake of wisdom, education, and profit. But through contact with the other pupils, they learnt there nothing but cunning and vice. The intelligent will understand this.
See, things haven't changed in 1400 years.
It is impossible for those who learn a craft wholeheartedly not to make daily advance in it. But some know their progress, while others by divine providence are ignorant of it. A good banker never fails in the evening to reckon the day's profit or loss. But he cannot know this clearly unless he enters it every hour in his ledger. For the hourly account brings to light the daily account. When a foolish person is accused or shouted at, he is wounded by it and tries to contradict or at once make an apology to his accuser, not out of humility, but in order to stop the accusations. But when you are being ridiculed, be silent and receive with patience these spiritual cauterizations, or rather purifying flames. And when the doctor is finished, then ask his forgiveness. For while he is angry, perhaps he will not accept your apology. While struggling against all the passions, let us who are in communities struggle every hour, especially against these two, greed of stomach and irritability. For in a community there is plenty of food for these passions. The devil suggests to those living in obedience the desire for impossible virtues. Similarly, to those living in stillness, he proposes unsuitable ideas. Scan the mind of inexperienced novices, and there you will find deluded notions, a desire for stillness, for the strictest fast, for uninterrupted prayer, for absolute freedom from vanity, for unbroken remembrance of death, for continual compunction, for perfect freedom from anger, for deep silence, for surpassing purity. And if by divine providence they are without these to start with, they leap in vain from one thing to another, having been deceived. For the enemy urges them to seek these perfections prematurely, so that they may not persevere and attain them in due course. But to those living in stillness, the deceiver extols hospitality, service, brotherly love, community life, visiting the sick. The devil's aim is to make the latter as impatient as the former. Only a few, and it is true what I say, can live in stillness. In fact, only they who have obtained divine consolation for encouragement in their labors and divine cooperation in their struggles. Let us judge the nature of our passions and of our obedience and choose our spiritual father accordingly. If you are prone to lust, then do not select as your trainer a wonder worker who is ready for everyone with a welcome and a meal, but rather an ascetic who will hear of no consolation in food. If you are haughty, then let him be stern and unyielding and not meek and kindly. Let us not seek those who have the gift of foreknowledge and foresight, but rather those who are unquestionably humble and whose character and place of residence correspond to our maladies. And after the example of the above-mentioned righteous Abbasiris, adopt this good habit, so conducive to obedience, of always thinking that the superior is testing you, and you will certainly never go wide of the mark. If your director constantly rebukes you, and you thereby obtain great faith and love for him, then know that the Holy Spirit has invisibly made his abode in your soul, and the power of the Most High has overshadowed you. But do not boast or rejoice when you bear insults and indignities courageously, but rather mourn that you have done something meriting rebuke, and incense the soul of your director against you. Do not be surprised at what I am going to say, for I have Moses to support me. It is better to sin against God than against your father. For when we anger God, our director can reconcile us. But when he is incensed against us, we no longer have anyone to make propitiation for us. But it seems to me that both cases amount to the same thing. Let us look carefully and distinguish and keep alert as to when we ought to endure thankfully and silently accusations made by our pastor, and when we ought to reassure him. It seems to me that in all cases when indignity is offered to us, we should be silent, for it is our moment of profit. But in those cases where another person is involved, we should put up a defense so as to maintain the link of love and peace unbroken. Those who have leapt out of obedience will tell you of its value, for it was only then that they fully realized the heaven in which they were living. He who is running towards dispassion and God regards as a great loss any day in which he is not reviled. Just as trees swayed by the wind drive their roots deeply into the earth, so those who live in obedience get strong and unshakable souls. He who has come to know his weakness by living in stillness, and has then changed his place and sold himself to obedience, though he is blind, gazes toward Christ without difficulty. Keep at it, brother athletes, and I will say it again, keep running, as you hear wisdom crying of you. As gold in the furnace, or rather in a community, the Lord has tried them, and as a whole burnt offering has he received them into his bosom. To him belongs the glory and eternal dominion, and the unoriginate Father, and with the holy and adorable Spirit. Amen. The step is equal in number to the evangelists. Athlete, keep running fearlessly.
So we'll end there for tonight. Questions, comments?
If the novice is directed towards basically striving to live like an angel spiritually, how do the elders produce that? There was a phrase endure the scorn and abuse of your elder.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that elder come from if the novice that walked in was always guided towards not that?
Well, the novice might be,
At what point, how does that happen?
well, the novice might have held up before him as the ideal to live like an angel, but in reality, he's very far from it. And so when he's, and so he's going to fall short. And so the scorn, abuse, the reviling, the insults, the discipline, all of that stuff is given by the elder to help him correct himself and to become more mindful and to so that he can begin to approach the goal. But a novice, there's no expectation that a novice is going to live like an angel, but everyone in the monastic world has this kind of ideal of attaining to dispassion, of attaining to true obedience, of attaining to humility, and so all of these steps, the perseverance, the endurance of all sorts of trials and tribulations and insults and reviling and stuff, all of that leads to that state of being, of humility, of dispassion, and so novices novices are just novices,
The point of so a novice will lead this life of obedience and striving for dispassion for years on end.
Mm-hmm.
At which point he becomes capable of dishing out the abuse and the scorn
Well,
for the one that comes after him.
yeah, it's not done out of pleasure. If you have some kind of elder who enjoys doing that kind of thing, he's a sick dude, and but it's done as a means of it's a means to an end and any novice who's you have to have gone through it in order to eventually do it
Understand what's profitable
Yeah.
for
and to understand what's profitable, so that you can say, oh yeah, I went through that. This was what was said and what and it woke me up and it made me understand my actions and my reactions and my attitude and why it was wrong, why my actions and attitude were wrong, so that I could correct myself. Because that's the whole reason for all of this stuff, so that we can become more conscious and not live according to our own discernment of what we think is right and wrong, but can live according to the discernment of the elder who helps us understand what is right and wrong. Because the best thing that we do to ourselves is deceive ourselves. We're masters at it, and it's arrogance, it's conceit, it's vainglory, it's pride, it's all of these other things, and all of these fantasies that we have about who we are and what we can do and what we should do and what we want to do and all of this other stuff. We have to just get rid of all of that and completely submit ourselves to our spiritual director, who will help us achieve the potential that we actually do have instead of what we dream that we have.
like disciplining a child.
Exactly.
You might try to act like mean or
Right.
strict, even though speaking from myself, it gives me no pleasure, but I feel like I have to make a point.
Right? And sometimes the sign of the impact of hand-on diaper is very helpful. You know, with a small child. And sometimes the impact of knuckles on the noggin is also,
Have to get their attention.
yeah,
The one that spares the stick doesn't always sound.
that's right.
I have a question about 121.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of it, it says, "It's better to sin against God than our Father, for when we anger God, our director can reconcile us. But when He is incensed against us, we no longer have anyone to make propitiation for us." That makes sense. I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, how are ways in which we aggravate and incense our spiritual fathers? How are the many ways?
Well, if you talk back, if you flip him off, if you're disobedient, you know,
Yeah.
it's just, it really is a parental relationship. And, of course, hopefully one grows through that into maturity more quickly than in a natural parental relationship.
What triggers me as a parent is like if there's some kind of danger, to get him out of danger, to teach him to stay out of danger. If I see him running towards the stairs without watching, that would trigger me to sound mean and act mean,
Yeah.
and maybe make it last a little longer, a little past the few seconds to just say, "Hey, be careful."
Mm-hmm. There's nothing like defiance and passive-aggressive nonsense to irritate a parent, right? You know, and whether it's outright or whether it's, you know, so, you know, and you encounter all this same stuff, you know, or contradiction, all this other stuff. You know, insisting on doing one's own will. And sometimes, you know you're in trouble if your spiritual father says to you, "Your kingdom come, your will be done." You know? So, it's not quite what they do in here, but you get the idea. You know, and you know, it's like breaking a horse. You know, and the horse has to be broken in order for it to be bridled and saddled.
Has to be trained before you can take it to war.
Yeah, has to be trained before you can get on it to train it. You know, so so there's a multitude of ways. You know, and obviously this is monastic context, and what you can do in a monastic context is totally different than in a parochial context. So much of this is not relevant, but the principles are relevant.
Yeah, because we're all in obedience to God.
Right,
And
exactly.
He's given us the church and the
Mhm.
scriptures,
Mm-hmm.
and especially 118, I almost add, it's not only novices, us converts.
Oh, absolutely.
Scan the mind of an inexperienced novice, and there you'll find deluded notions, a desire for stillness, for the strictest fast, for uninterrupted prayer, for absolute freedom from vanity, for unbroken remembrance of death, for continual compunction, for perfect freedom from anger, for deep silence, for surpassing purity.
Mm-hmm.
How many converts? Yeah.
And it's like, okay, let's get the creed down first. You know? Yeah. It's very nice that you want to go off and be an ascetic, but you get baptized first. You know? And it's quite funny, you know.
Come to liturgy on time.
Yeah. Come to liturgy, yeah. Yeah. Be there before liturgy starts more than 2 Sundays in a row.